Today, I am going to speak about the history of American Independence Day and the struggle of America versus the British Empire. In the 18th century, the 13 American colonies were under British rule. Although the colonies were growing economically, the British government imposed heavy taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act without allowing the colonists any representation in the British Parliament. This led to the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." As tensions increased, protests became more common. One of the most famous protests was the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American colonists threw British tea into Boston Harbor to protest unfair taxes. Britain responded with strict laws, making the conflict even worse. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War began between the American colonies and the British Empire. The colonists, led by leaders such as George Washington, fought bravely for freedom and self-government. On July 4, 1776, the United States Declaration of Independence was adopted, mainly written by Thomas Jefferson. It declared that the American colonies were free and independent states, no longer under British rule. This date is now celebrated every year as American Independence Day. The war continued until 1783, when Britain officially recognized American independence through the Treaty of Paris. The United States became a new independent nation based on the ideals of liberty, democracy, and equality. Today, Americans celebrate Independence Day with parades, fireworks, concerts, family gatherings, and ceremonies that honor the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom. The history of American Independence Day teaches us the importance of courage, unity, justice, and the right of people to govern themselves. It reminds us that freedom often comes through determination and sacrifice. Today, I am going to speak about the history of American Independence Day and the struggle of America versus the British Empire. In the 18th century, the 13 American colonies were under British rule. Although the colonies were growing economically, the British government imposed heavy taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act without allowing the colonists any representation in the British Parliament. This led to the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." As tensions increased, protests became more common. One of the most famous protests was the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American colonists threw British tea into Boston Harbor to protest unfair taxes. Britain responded with strict laws, making the conflict even worse. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War began between the American colonies and the British Empire. The colonists, led by leaders such as George Washington, fought bravely for freedom and self-government. On July 4, 1776, the United States Declaration of Independence was adopted, mainly written by Thomas Jefferson. It declared that the American colonies were free and independent states, no longer under British rule. This date is now celebrated every year as American Independence Day. The war continued until 1783, when Britain officially recognized American independence through the Treaty of Paris. The United States became a new independent nation based on the ideals of liberty, democracy, and equality. Today, Americans celebrate Independence Day with parades, fireworks, concerts, family gatherings, and ceremonies that honor the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom. The history of American Independence Day teaches us the importance of courage, unity, justice, and the right of people to govern themselves. It reminds us that freedom often comes through determination and sacrifice. Before the United States became an independent nation, the eastern part of North America consisted of 13 colonies that were under the control of the British Empire. These colonies included places such as Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Although the colonists had their own local governments and elected assemblies, the British government and the British king had the ultimate authority over all major political and economic decisions. The colonies played a vital role in strengthening the British Empire. They supplied Britain with valuable raw materials such as tobacco, cotton, timber, furs, and other agricultural products. In return, the colonists purchased manufactured goods from Britain. This trade system greatly benefited the British economy, but many colonists believed that it mainly served British interests rather than their own. As the population and economy of the colonies grew, many Americans wanted a greater voice in governing their own affairs. However, Britain continued to control colonial trade, pass laws affecting the colonies, and appoint royal governors to oversee local administration. The colonists increasingly felt that decisions about their lives were being made by a government thousands of miles away, without properly considering their needs and opinions. These growing political and economic tensions gradually created dissatisfaction among the colonists. Many believed they deserved the same rights and freedoms as citizens living in Britain, including fair representation in government and a greater role in making laws that affected their daily lives. As these concerns continued to grow, the relationship between the American colonies and the British Empire became increasingly strained, laying the foundation for future conflict. After the costly French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the British government faced a large national debt and decided that the American colonies should help pay for the expenses of defending the empire. To raise money, Britain introduced a series of new taxes and laws that directly affected the colonists. These measures marked a major turning point in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. One of the first major taxes was the Sugar Act of 1764, which placed duties on sugar, molasses, and other imported goods. This was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase official stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, contracts, and even playing cards. Since these taxes affected people from nearly every profession and social class, they caused widespread frustration throughout the colonies. Britain later introduced the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed taxes on imported items such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. In 1773, the Tea Act gave the British East India Company special privileges in selling tea to the colonies. Although the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea, many colonists opposed it because they believed Britain was using it to force them to accept Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. The greatest source of anger was not simply the taxes themselves, but the fact that the colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, the body that created these laws. They argued that it was unfair for a government in which they had no voice to impose taxes on them. This belief was captured in the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." As opposition grew, merchants organized boycotts of British goods, local leaders held public meetings, and groups such as the Sons of Liberty encouraged resistance against British policies. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches spread the idea that the colonists were being denied the rights enjoyed by other British citizens. These protests united people from different colonies and strengthened the growing belief that they should have greater control over their own government and their own future. The Boston Tea Party was one of the most significant events leading to the American Revolution. It took place on the night of December 16, 1773, in Boston, Massachusetts, and became a powerful symbol of resistance against British rule. The protest was not simply about tea. It was a direct challenge to Britain's authority and its policy of taxing the American colonies without their consent. The conflict began after the British Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. This law allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the American colonies at a lower price than local merchants. Although the tea became cheaper, many colonists believed the law was designed to make them accept Britain's right to impose taxes without giving them representation in Parliament. They feared that accepting the tea would also mean accepting British control over colonial affairs. Many merchants and political leaders in Boston strongly opposed the Tea Act. Public meetings were held where thousands of colonists gathered to discuss how they should respond. They demanded that the ships carrying British tea return to England without unloading their cargo. However, the royal governor of Massachusetts refused to allow the ships to leave the harbor until the required taxes had been paid. On the evening of December 16th, a group of about 60 colonists, many of whom were members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Mohawk Native Americans. They boarded 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Working quickly and in an organized manner, they opened hundreds of wooden tea chests and dumped approximately 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The tea was destroyed, but no other property was damaged, and nothing else was stolen. The protesters wanted to send a clear political message rather than commit acts of theft or violence. The British government reacted with anger. It viewed the destruction of the tea as an attack on British authority and decided to punish the colony of Massachusetts. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of strict laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea had been paid for, reduced the powers of the Massachusetts colonial government, increased British military authority, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried outside the colony under certain circumstances. Instead of weakening colonial resistance, these harsh measures united many of the 13 colonies. Leaders from different colonies began cooperating more closely, believing that if Britain could punish Massachusetts so severely, the same could happen elsewhere. Committees exchanged information, colonial assemblies expressed support for Boston, and representatives from across the colonies started discussing a common response to British policies, bringing the colonies closer together in their growing movement for self-government. The American Revolutionary War was the armed conflict between the 13 American colonies and the British Empire that lasted from 1775 to 1783. The war was fought because many colonists believed that Britain had violated their rights by imposing taxes, restricting trade, and governing the colonies without their consent. What began as a dispute over political rights gradually developed into a full-scale struggle for independence and self-government. The first battles of the war took place on April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. British troops were sent to seize colonial weapons and arrest Patriot leaders, but local militia forces resisted. These battles marked the beginning of open warfare between Britain and the American colonies. Soon afterward, thousands of volunteers joined local militias, ready to defend their communities and fight against British rule. As the conflict expanded, the colonies formed the Continental Army, a unified military force created by the Second Continental Congress. In June 1775, George Washington was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Although Washington had limited resources, poorly trained soldiers, and shortages of food, weapons, clothing, and ammunition, he worked tirelessly to organize, discipline, and strengthen the army into an effective fighting force. The British Empire possessed one of the strongest militaries in the world. It had a large, well-trained army, a powerful navy, experienced officers, and greater financial resources. In contrast, the American forces often faced difficult conditions. Many soldiers lacked proper uniforms, suffered through harsh winters, and received little or no pay. Despite these hardships, they remained determined to continue fighting for the ideals of liberty and self-government. Throughout the war, several important battles shaped the course of the conflict. The Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775 demonstrated that colonial forces could challenge experienced British troops, even though the British technically won the battle. The Battle of Trenton in late 1776, where George Washington led a surprise attack after crossing the icy Delaware River, greatly improved American morale during a difficult period. Another major turning point came at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where the American victory convinced France that the colonies had a realistic chance of winning the war. France became America's most important ally by providing soldiers, weapons, money, supplies, and naval support. Later, Spain and the Dutch Republic also opposed Britain, increasing pressure on the British Empire around the world. This international support greatly strengthened the American cause and forced Britain to divide its military resources across multiple regions. The final major military campaign occurred at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. American forces under George Washington, together with French troops led by General Rochambeau and supported by the French Navy, surrounded the British Army commanded by General Charles Cornwallis in Virginia. After weeks of siege and heavy bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. Although fighting continued in some areas for a short time, the surrender at Yorktown effectively ended major military operations and paved the way for peace negotiations between Britain and the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents in American history. It officially announced that the 13 American colonies were no longer under the authority of the British Empire and considered themselves to be free and independent states. Rather than being just a declaration of separation, The document explained the political principles behind the decision and listed the reasons why the colonies believed independence had become necessary. As tensions with Britain continued to grow during the early stages of the Revolutionary War, many colonial leaders realized that simply asking for reforms would no longer solve the conflict. More people began supporting complete independence instead of remaining loyal to the British Crown. This growing support led the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, to appoint a committee to prepare a formal declaration explaining why the colonies were choosing independence. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. Among them, Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft because of his skill as a writer and his clear understanding of political philosophy. Jefferson based many of his ideas on the principles of natural rights, individual liberty, and the belief that governments receive their authority from the consent of the people. One of the most famous passages of the Declaration states that all men are created equal, and that every person possesses certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also argues that governments are established to protect these rights, and that when a government becomes destructive to them, the people have the right to change or replace it with a new government that better serves their interests. A large portion of the Declaration contains a detailed list of grievances against King George III. The document accuses the king of abusing his power by imposing taxes without consent, interfering with colonial governments, maintaining standing armies during peacetime, restricting trade, denying fair trials, dissolving representative assemblies, and ignoring the petitions of the colonists. These complaints were presented to show the international community that the colonies had legitimate reasons for seeking independence. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. After making several revisions to Jefferson's draft, the Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. This date has since become one of the most significant in American history and is celebrated every year as Independence Day. Copies of the Declaration were printed and distributed throughout the colonies, where they were read aloud in town squares, churches, military camps, and public gatherings, inspiring many people to support the cause of independence. The Declaration also served an important international purpose. By publicly announcing that the colonies were independent nations, American leaders hoped to gain diplomatic recognition and military assistance from foreign countries, particularly France. The document demonstrated that the colonies were not merely rebelling against Britain but were establishing a new nation founded on principles of representative government, individual rights, equality before the law, and the belief that political authority should come from the consent of the governed. After the decisive American and French victory at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Britain realized that continuing the war would be costly and increasingly difficult. Although fighting continued in a few places for a short time, both sides soon began peace negotiations. Representatives of the United States and Great Britain met in Paris, France, to discuss the terms that would officially end the conflict and establish a lasting peace. These negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on September 3, 1783. Through this historic agreement, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The treaty also established the new nation's borders, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, giving the United States control over a vast area of land. In addition, Britain agreed to withdraw its military forces from American territory, while both countries pledged to restore peaceful relations after years of war. Winning independence marked the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of the nation's challenges. The 13 former colonies now had the responsibility of building a stable government, managing their economy, protecting their borders, and creating laws for a free and independent country. Leaders from different states worked together to develop a stronger political system that could unite the new nation while preserving the rights of its citizens. In the years that followed, the United States adopted the Constitution of the United States in 1787, creating a federal government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Shortly afterward, the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, guaranteeing important freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to peaceful assembly, and protection under the law. These documents became the foundation of American democracy and influenced constitutional development in many other countries. The success of the American Revolution had a significant impact beyond North America. It inspired people in other parts of the world who were seeking greater political rights and self-government. Revolutionary movements in countries such as France and several nations in Latin America drew inspiration from the American struggle for independence and the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. The belief that governments should derive their authority from the consent of the people became an influential political principle around the world. Every year on July 4th, the people of the United States celebrate Independence Day to honor the nation's founding and the sacrifices made during the struggle for freedom. Across the country, communities organize parades, fireworks displays, concerts, historical reenactments, public ceremonies, family gatherings, picnics, and cultural events. Government buildings, homes, and public spaces are decorated with the American flag, and many citizens reflect on the values of liberty, democracy, equality, and national unity that shaped the country's history. The legacy of American independence continues to influence the nation's identity, political institutions, and civic traditions. The events between 1775 and 1783 transformed 13 British colonies into a sovereign nation and established principles that have remained central to American government and public life. The struggle for independence demonstrated the importance of representative government, constitutional law, the protection of individual rights, and the belief that citizens should play an active role in shaping the future of their country.